Federalist 46, Part 4. We are in middle of paragraph 9, and we've been talking about how Madison tells the readers that no way the American people are going to have more loyalty to the federal government than the state governments. And most of the time their loyalty would be to their state governments, even their county governments, people that are closest to them than their state government or national government. But for the first time, he actually says that if federal government becomes too tyrannical, even if we people have fallen asleep and not paid attention to who we have elected the past few election cycles, and these people have betrayed us and given the federal government the means to crush our liberty, we Americans are free-loving, we're armed, and we can stand up actually to the federal government. This is the first time he goes this deeply into saying that American people can defend themselves when the time comes, organize and crush the federal government, just like we stood up to the British and declared independence and eventually won the war. So here I'll start with this sentence: extravagant as the supposition is, let it however be made, let a regular army fully equal to the resources of the country be formed, and let it be entirely at the devotion of the federal government. So he says, okay, let's even imagine that the federal government has raised an army. Still, it would not be going too far to say that the state governments, with the people on their side, would be able to repel the danger. The highest number to which, according to the best computation, a standing army can be carried in any country does not exceed 1/100th part of the whole number of souls, or 1/25th part of the number able to bear arms. This proportion would not yield in the United States an army of more than 25,000 to 30,000 men. To these would be opposed a militia amounting to near 500,000 of citizens with arms in their hands, officered by men chosen from among themselves, fight for their common liberties, and united and conducted by governments possessing their affections and confidence. See, he even goes as far as saying how many troops can a federal government raise, and then he turns around and says people in the states can stand up. There'll be almost 500,000 of them that can defend their freedom and crush the federal government. It may well be doubted whether a militia thus circumstanced could ever be conquered by such a proportion of regular troops. Those who are best acquainted with the late successful resistance of this country against the British arms will be most inclined to deny the possibility of it. Besides the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation, the existence of subordinate governments to which the people are attached and by which the militia officers are appointed forms a barrier against the enterprise of ambition, more insurmountable than any which a simple government of any form can admit of. Notwithstanding the military establishment in the several kingdoms of Europe, which are carried as far as the public resources will bear, the governments are afraid to trust the people with arms. He says, we are not like the British, we are not like the European countries. People are not armed. The monarch or whoever is the ruler does not allow the people to be armed. But he says, we are armed. We have weapons. And it is not certain that with this aid alone, they would not be able to shake off their yokes. But we, the people, to possess the additional advantages of local governments chosen by themselves, who could collect the national will and direct the national force, and of officers appointed out of militia by these governments and attached both to them and to the militia, it may be affirmed with the greatest assurance that the throne of every tyranny in Europe would be speedily overturned in spite of the legions which surround it. Let us not insult the free and gallant citizens of America with the suspicion that they would be less able to defend the rights of which they would be in actual possession than the debased subjects of arbitrary power would be to rescue theirs from the hands of their oppressors. He says, even if in Europe, if majority of people had arms, they would stand up to their monarchs and overthrow them. He says, now if you look at America, we are free-loving people. We've had traditions of freedom. We have local government. We have state government. We've always been armed and ready to defend ourselves. So if the Europeans can stand up to a tyrannical government, if they are half-armed, we Americans, who've already crushed the British here, can stand up to any federal government that wants to overstep its bounds. Let us rather no longer insult them with the supposition that they can ever reduce themselves to the necessity of making the experiment by blind and tame submission to the long train of insidious measures which must precede and produce it. Listen, this is echoes of the Declaration of Independence also. A long train. Over there it says long train of abuses. Here it says long train of insidious measures which must precede and produce it. The next paragraph, the argument under the present head may be put into a very concise form which appears altogether conclusive. Either the mode in which the federal government is to be constructed will render it sufficiently dependent on the people, or it will not. On the first supposition, it will be restrained by that dependence from forming schemes obnoxious to their constituents. On the other supposition, it will not possess the confidence of the people, and its schemes of usurpation will be easily defeated by the state governments who will be supported by the people. So if the federal government has this support and trust of the people, the federal government will never try to be enemies of the people. But if it doesn't, and people stop trusting it, then we have a line of defense, and that's the state governments. And if need be, we have the arms, weapons, we can get organized and fight the federal government. And the last paragraph, on summing up the considerations stated in this and the last paper, they seem to amount the most convincing evidence that the powers proposed to be lodged in the federal government are as little formidable to those reserved to the individual states as they are indispensably necessary to accomplish the purposes of the Union. We need the state governments to have a union. And we will see from what we have read in this paper and the last paper, he says, that federal government is not going to overreach, overstep its bounds, and is going to be is going to create a great government for you to unite under and prosper. And that all those alarms which have been sounded of a mediated and consequential annihilation of state governments must, and the most favorable interpretation be ascribed to the chimerical fears of the authors themselves. Remember, again, chimerical, something that's illusory, something that's impossible. It's a fantasy in the heads of those people who are writing these articles in the newspapers, attacking us and telling us that the federal government is going to do away with the state governments. He says that's not going to happen at all. So don't listen to these people who are either enemies of your future freedom and enemies of your happiness, or are not knowledgeable enough and wise enough to see what's best for you.